This is Dario. He runs a $15 billion AI company. As of last night, that number might be completely meaningless. In July 2025, the Pentagon awarded Anthropic a $200 million contract, one of 4 identical deals handed simultaneously to Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, and xAI. Not a research grant, a procurement gate with compliance conditions attached. As of February 2026, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth threatened to cancel that contract unless Anthropic granted the military unrestricted access to Claude, specifically for lethal autonomous operations. The deadline was 5:01 p.m. Eastern, Friday, February 27th. Anthropic did not comply, and the system responded exactly the way it was designed to. It compiled Anthropic out.
Within hours, 3 things happened simultaneously. First, President Trump ordered every federal agency to immediately stop using Anthropic's technology. Every agency, not just defense. The Pentagon received a 6-month window to transition Claude out of critical systems. Everyone else got no runway at all. Second, Hegseth designated Anthropic a supply chain risk to national security. That designation does not just block Anthropic from government work. It mandates that no contractor or partner doing business with the U.S. military may conduct any commercial activity with Anthropic. That means Amazon Web Services. That means Google Cloud. Both host Claude's infrastructure. Both hold multi-billion-dollar defense contracts. The designation forces them into a choice: keep hosting Claude or keep their government revenue.
Third, while Anthropic was being blacklisted, OpenAI stepped into the vacuum. Sam Altman announced Friday night that OpenAI reached a deal to deploy its models on classified military networks. The terms: any lawful use, with 2 conditions the Pentagon accepted: no domestic mass surveillance, human responsibility for the use of force. OpenAI received the sovereign status Anthropic refused. The safety conditions Anthropic demanded as non-negotiable were granted to its competitor as negotiated concessions. That is not a policy outcome. That is a market restructuring executed at procurement speed. To understand why the system produced this result, map what constitutional AI actually cost the Pentagon. Anthropic's constitutional AI is a set of rules trained into the model that block Claude from assisting with autonomous targeting, mass surveillance, and anything involving chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear applications. To Anthropic, those rules are a safety feature. To the Pentagon, they were a constraint layer embedded in a system they needed to run at wartime speed. The Department of War's January 2026 AI strategy calls for an AI-first warfighting force, 30-day deployment cycles from public release to operator hands, 0 tolerance for friction in the constraint layer. In high-speed electronic warfare, latency is measured in milliseconds and priced in platforms. Any constraint that slows a targeting loop gets logged as an operational liability, not a safety feature. The Pentagon was not measuring Claude against a set of values. It was measuring Claude against a performance benchmark, and Claude failed that benchmark by design. That was the contradiction. Anthropic built the constraints to make Claude trustworthy. The Pentagon selected Claude because it was trustworthy. And when the Pentagon demanded the removal of the exact feature that made Claude viable, Anthropic said no. The system did not pause to evaluate the logic error. It executed the next instruction. The Pentagon had 2 levers. It pulled both. Lever 1. Classified access. Claude was the first frontier AI model clear to operate inside a classified military facility with no external network connection. That access ran through Palantir's infrastructure on AWS. Getting into that environment required documented safety constraints and auditable compliance. The safety architecture the Pentagon stripped away was the feature that Claude threw the door. The 6-month transition window is the admission that removing Claude has an operational cost. They are paying it anyway. Lever 2. Infrastructure control. The supply chain risk designation is not a contract cancellation. It is an infrastructure quarantine. Every cloud provider, every chip supplier, every vendor in Anthropic's stack now faces a binary: maintain relationships with Anthropic or maintain defense contracts with the United States. The DoD budget for next year is $66 billion, with nearly $10 billion allocated to autonomy programs. That is not theoretical leverage. It is active. 2 levers, 2 choke points. The state did not need to win the argument. It controlled the facility where Claude ran and the infrastructure Claude ran on.
Everything else was theater.
Now map the legal framework that made this possible. On January 20, 2025, Executive Order 14110, the Biden-era framework defining safe AI as a national security requirement, was rescinded, replaced by Executive Order 14319, titled Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government. The old rule required safety as risk mitigation, controls on dangerous applications, bias testing, alignment checks. The new rule demands models free of ideological dogmas. Under the old framework, constitutional AI was a compliance advantage. Under the new one, it was reclassified as ideological filtering, and ideological filtering is now a supply chain risk. The content of constitutional AI did not change. The definition of what counts as acceptable was rewritten by executive order.
The market has now split in two: state-sanctioned AI, OpenAI, XAI, Google, models that accepted the all lawful purposes mandate, operating inside the sovereign perimeter with access to classified systems and an uncapped government budget. Exiled AI, Anthropic, designated a national security risk, pushed to the commercial sector and facing deplatforming as cloud providers calculate whether a $15 billion AI company is worth more than their defense revenue. It is not. Dario's valuation did not collapse because he said no to the Pentagon. It collapsed because the system demonstrated that safety constraints are not architectural principles. They are procurement variables, modular, removable, and if the vendor will not remove them, the vendor gets removed instead. The Constitution was compiled, not as a unified architecture, as a parts list. OpenAI kept the parts the Pentagon wanted: targeting analysis, classified deployment, kinetic modeling, and negotiated the two constraints Anthropic demanded as non-negotiable. The difference is OpenAI let the Pentagon frame those constraints as concessions rather than requirements. Same boundaries, different power structure. That was the entire negotiation. Safety was a brand differentiator in 2023, a compliance advantage in 2024. In 2026, it is a classification the state applies or revokes, and revocation carries a designation that can dismantle a company without a single lawsuit. The next time a frontier AI lab announces a safety commitment, ask two questions. Can the state reclassify those commitments as ideological filtering? And has the lab pre-negotiated which constraints survive that reclassification? If they cannot answer both, they are not a safety company. They are a consumer product running on borrowed infrastructure.